I always believed that if anything strange or unusual happened in your life, you could trace it back to a single moment or decision. For me, that moment was the day I decided to bring home a stray cat. Or at least, I thought he was a stray. His name, though I didn't name him, was Mr. Whiskers. And he was the beginning of a chain of events I never expected. It was a blistering July afternoon when I stumbled across him. I was on my way home from my part-time job at the local bookstore, exhausted from a day of sorting dusty tomes and rearranging the self-help section per my boss's request. The sun was setting, bleeding orange light across the asphalt. Humidity clung to my skin, making every breath thick and heavy. I'd taken my usual shortcut through a deserted alleyway, a questionable habit that saved me a good 10 minutes off my walk. Halfway through, I heard a faint mew. It was so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. But there it was again, a weak cry, like something in pain. My heart hammered. I had always been the sort of person who would break for squirrels and leave water out for neighborhood strays. I couldn't just walk away from what sounded like an injured animal. Following the noise, I found a skinny, silver-gray cat curled against a trash bin. His fur was matted, and he seemed disoriented. When he saw me, his eyes locked onto mine, vivid green, flecked with hints of gold. There was something almost human in that stare, something that made my spine tingle. But I was more concerned about his condition. He looked hungry, on the verge of collapse. I approached slowly, palms out to show him in no harm. "Hey there, buddy," I whispered, crouching down. "You lost?" The cat blinked, meowed again, and then stepped forward unsteadily, rubbing against my leg. It was like he was saying, "Take me with you." I knew better than to pick up strays off the street, but my heart got the better of me. Besides, I'd always wanted a pet, and there was no collar or tag in sight. That moment sealed my fate. I wrapped him in my light jacket and carried him the rest of the way home. He didn't struggle once. My apartment was a tiny one-bedroom in a half-renovated old building. Paint peeled from the walls in the hallway, and the elevator made loud clanking noises that never failed to unnerve me. But it was home. Inside, I set the cat on a towel in the bathroom, figuring I'd clean him up and give him some food. He didn't resist when I wiped the grime from his fur, though he fixed me with that green-gold stare the entire time. It was strangely intense, as though he was memorizing every detail of my face. "You have the most stunning eyes," I murmured. He blinked, and for a moment, I felt a cold little thrill run through me. Cats can have captivating gazes, sure, but this was different, like he understood me on some deeper level. Once he was relatively clean, I offered him water and a bowl of tuna I'd scrounged up from the back of the pantry. He devoured it like he hadn't eaten in days, purring so loudly it reverberated in my small bathroom. I remember thinking, he must have been starving out there. Later that night, I made a makeshift bed out of an old comforter in the living room. I left him to rest, but he followed me into my bedroom, jumped up onto the foot of my bed, and curled into a little ball. It was both adorable and a tad presumptuous, but I couldn't bring myself to shoo him away. "What should I call you?" I asked softly. He blinked once, then rested his chin on his paws. Mr. Whiskers seemed fitting somehow, a playful yet old-fashioned name. It slipped out of my mouth without much thought. Maybe I'd heard it in passing or seen it in a movie. He accepted it with a small MRP sound. If I only knew then what the name would come to signify. The next few weeks, I fell into a routine of feeding Mr. Whiskers, playing with him in the evenings, and stepping around the new cat toys scattered across my living room floor. He adapted quickly, almost too quickly, to apartment life. I took him to the vet for a checkup. Surprisingly, he was in good health aside from being underweight. No microchip, no missing pet notices matching his description. The vet gave me a few tips on feeding him a specialized diet to help him gain weight, and that was that. My friend, Melissa, came over to meet him. She was the kind of person who squealed at the sight of any furry animal. But the moment she locked eyes with Mr. Whiskers, she stopped in her tracks, her grin fading. Later, she admitted he gave her the creeps, something about the way he stared felt too intense. I laughed it off at the time, figuring she was overreacting. It was only after a few small oddities piled up that I started to wonder if she was onto something. For instance, Mr. Whiskers would meow at odd hours of the night, not just a normal feed me cry, but a deep, rumbling yell that echoed off the walls. Sometimes, I'd wake up to find him perched on the windowsill, peering out into the dark, his tail flicking like he was annoyed at something out there. Other times, he'd stare at the walls, arch his back, and hiss at nothing, as far as I could tell. Each occurrence I rationalized away. Cats can be weird, especially rescues. Maybe he was just adjusting. One late evening, I was in my bedroom folding laundry. Mr. Whiskers had been napping in the living room, or so I thought. Suddenly, he padded in, meowed, and dropped something at my feet. At first, I thought it was a sock or a hair tie. But when I picked it up, I realized it was a small, old-looking coin. It felt cold, heavier than it should be for its size, and the edges were etched with strange, faded symbols. I'd never seen anything like it. "Where did you get this?" I asked, even though I knew he couldn't respond. He blinked once, his gaze unwavering. I half expected him to open his mouth and speak. I tucked the coin away in a desk drawer, assuming he'd found it under a piece of furniture or behind the fridge. Maybe the previous tenant had dropped it. But that night, I couldn't get it out of my head. The symbols had been almost serpentine, winding around the edge like protective warts. A part of me shivered. Within days, more peculiar items appeared, a bird's feather, so black it seemed to absorb light, a tiny glass vial filled with some dark residue, a twisted nail, rusted almost beyond recognition. Each time, Mr. Whiskers would drop his gift on the floor and watch my reaction. It became a ritual of sorts. He'd bring an item, and I'd hide it away or toss it in the trash, unsettled but unsure what else to do. I noticed, too, that my apartment started feeling different. The atmosphere got heavier, like a storm approaching. The corners of rooms seemed darker, and the usual city noises outside felt more distant. My sleep grew restless. In my dreams, I'd see flickers of black feathers, shining coins, and outstretched claws. I'd wake up gasping, with Mr. Whiskers perched on my nightstand, staring at me as though I were the odd one. Melissa's visits dwindled. She said she felt uncomfortable in my place. "Your cat's cute," she told me over the phone one day, "but the vibe in your apartment is so off. It's like the air is thick. I can't explain it." I tried to shrug it off, but deep down, I felt it too. My mother was never one to mince words. When I confided in her, somewhat nervously, about the eerie items Mr. Whiskers kept bringing me, she was quick to jump to conclusions. "Honey, that cat might be trouble. Some animals carry energies," she said, pausing for dramatic effect. "You should get rid of him." "Mom, that's ridiculous. He's not haunted or anything." Even as I said it, I felt a twinge of doubt. She just sighed. "Do what you want, but don't say I didn't warn you." I found myself resenting her words. Mr. Whiskers was my responsibility. I'd taken him in. And yes, he was acting strangely, but how could I abandon him just because I was unsettled? Yet each day, my conviction wavered a little more as I caught him staring at empty corners, as the so-called gifts multiplied in bizarre variety. A crumpled piece of paper with a scribbled symbol I couldn't read, a single rose petal that looked fresh but smelled rotten, a small tarnished key that obviously belonged to no lock in my apartment. I was both frightened and inexplicably drawn to the mysteries these objects represented. The nightmares got worse. I dreamed of shadowy figures standing at the foot of my bed, whispering in voices that sounded like my own thoughts reflected back at me. In some dreams, Mr. Whiskers would appear in the corner, eyes glowing green, as though orchestrating the entire scene. More than once, I jolted awake, convinced someone else was in the room. Adrenaline spiked through my system, leaving me shaking and drenched in sweat. My phone's screen would show 3 o'clock or 4 a.m., the dead of night. Peeking over the edge of my bed, I'd see Mr. Whiskers sitting quietly on the floor, tail wrapped around his paws. His eyes never left me. I tried to tell myself it was stress from work. I was barely making rent, the bookstore was cutting my hours, and I spent most days anxious about my future. That had to be it. No cat was causing this. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. One afternoon, I decided to gather all the odd trinkets Mr. Whiskers had brought me. I spread them out on my coffee table, a small coin with etched symbols, the black feather, the rusted nail, the glass vial, the scrap of paper with indecipherable writing, the key, and a handful of other random objects. Together, they looked like the spoils of a deranged treasure hunt. Impulsively, I Googled phrases like strange symbols on coins and cat brings cursed objects. My search led me into internet rabbit holes, paranormal forums, folklore websites, random blog posts about cursed antiques. Most of it seemed absurd, but certain patterns kept cropping up, references to portals and energy siphons, to cats acting as conduits for spirits. The rational part of me scoffed, but a tiny part whispered, what if there's some truth here? That night, as if sensing my doubts, Mr. Whiskers meowed insistently until I followed him to the hallway. He led me to a spot on the floor near the closet, meowed again, and clawed at the baseboard. When I leaned down, I realized the board was slightly loose. Curiosity piqued, I pried it open. Behind it was a narrow gap in the wall, and stuffed inside was another item, a tattered photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, her expression oddly vacant, her eyes scratched out by what appeared to be a sharp object. I nearly dropped it in shock. What the? Mr. Whiskers, how did you even find this? He meowed, then patted away, tail high, leaving me trembling in the dim hallway light. I was starting to feel like the line between my safe, ordinary life and a sinister undercurrent of darkness had been blurred beyond recognition. Desperate for clarity, I turned to the only person I knew who had an interest in the occult, my coworker, Jacob. He was a part-time tarot reader, part-time bookstore clerk. Most people wrote him off as a harmless eccentric, but I'd always liked him. He took me seriously, at least. When I explained everything, he stared at me for a long moment, then said, I've heard stories about cats being connected. Historically, they've been linked to witches, to spirits. Some claim they can cross between realms. Jacob, that sounds ridiculous? He shrugged. You asked for my honest opinion. Have you tried ridding yourself of the objects? I admitted I'd mostly been shoving them into drawers. They just reappear, or Mr. Whiskers finds something else. I don't even know where he's getting them. He never leaves the apartment, except for that night I found him. Jacob frowned. That's odd. Maybe you should do a cleansing. Sage the apartment, maybe use some protective symbols. Even if you don't believe in that stuff, it might bring peace of mind. Peace of mind. That was exactly what I needed. A few days later, Melissa, who had been feeling guilty for avoiding me, agreed to help. We lit sage, walked around the rooms, said generic protective mantras we'd found on the internet. Mr. Whiskers prowled behind us the entire time, occasionally making a low rumbling noise that set us both on edge. As we finished, the apartment did feel lighter, briefly. But that night, I woke to the sound of shattering glass. I raced to the living room to find my only expensive vase toppled, smashed to pieces on the floor. Mr. Whiskers sat on the windowsill, licking his paw with an air of indifference. The entire atmosphere felt malevolent, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Melissa stayed the night on my couch, only to wake up screaming around 2 a.m. She claimed she saw a black shape hovering near the ceiling. I rushed in to find her drenched in sweat, tears streaming down her face. Meanwhile, Mr. Whiskers watched from the corner, his eyes gleaming in the half-light. I can't stay here, she stuttered, grabbing her purse and fleeing into the night. She wouldn't answer her phone for days afterward. It wasn't just Melissa who became distant. My other friends stopped dropping by. Even phone calls became scarce. They all had excuses, busy with work, dealing with personal stuff. But I knew the truth. My once cozy apartment had turned into a place of tension and dread. People sensed it the moment they stepped inside. I felt more isolated than ever. My daily life revolved around going to the bookstore, coming home, and bracing myself for whatever new horror might unfold. My relationship with Mr. Whiskers turned strained. I still fed him, petted him occasionally, but fear lurked behind every interaction. I wanted to love him. After all, I'd rescued him. But the question haunted me, had I really rescued him, or had I invited something into my life that I couldn't understand? One afternoon, I noticed Mr. Whiskers wasn't in his usual napping spots. Alarmed, I searched the apartment, calling his name. I found him in my bedroom closet, lying amid a pile of laundry, staring at the wall. A soft sound, like distant whispering, seemed to emanate from the darkness around him. I flipped on the closet light, and the whispering vanished. But the chill in the air remained. Unable to take the mounting tension, I decided to get rid of the items once and for all. I gathered every cursed trinket, from the etched coin to the eerie photograph, and stuffed them in a cardboard box. That evening, I drove out to a remote wooded area near the river, certain that if I disposed of them far away, Mr. Whiskers wouldn't be able to bring them back. With a flashlight in one hand and the box in the other, I hiked until I reached a clearing. The wind rustled the tall grass, and the sky was an expanse of deep navy with no moon in sight. My heart pounded as I dug a shallow hole under a large oak tree, tossing the items in and covering them with dirt. A sense of grim satisfaction washed over me as I stomped the ground. That's it, I told myself. We're done. I returned home just past midnight. Mr. Whiskers was waiting at the front door, silent and still. His eyes bored into me as if to say, "What have you done?" I woke the next morning with a weird sense of anticipation, half expecting to see those objects back on my coffee table. To my relief, the apartment was free of any new trinkets. Mr. Whiskers ate his breakfast and then settled in for a nap. It felt almost normal until I opened my closet to find the box, intact, dirt clinging to its sides, resting among my shoes. My scream shattered the quiet morning. The same box I'd buried miles away had returned as if guided by invisible hands. I tore open the flaps, and every single item lay exactly as I had arranged them. That was the moment I felt something inside me break. A raw panic, a sense that I was dealing with forces far beyond my understanding. I stumbled backward, tears burning in my eyes. I kicked the box, sending the items scattering. Mr. Whiskers patted in, looking first at me, then at the objects on the floor. He made a peculiar low-pitched noise, something between a growl and a moan. I sank to my knees, feeling utterly powerless. This had gone beyond a series of spooky coincidences. Something truly unnatural was happening. That same day, Jacob from the bookstore put me in touch with someone he knew, a self-proclaimed medium named Margot. Out of desperation, I contacted her, spilling the entire story in a trembling voice. She didn't laugh. She listened carefully, then told me to bring Mr. Whiskers and the objects to her place. Margot lived in a small cottage on the edge of town. Herbs hung drying from the porch, and wind chimes made of crystals clinked in the breeze. The house smelled of lavender and sage, a welcome contrast to the thick, stale air I'd grown used to at home. She asked me to lay out the items in a circle on her living room floor. Mr. Whiskers was in a carrier, silent but glaring at me through the bars. Margot walked around, eyes closed, humming softly. I felt ridiculous, but the moment she knelt and placed her hands over one of the items, the black coin, her face contorted in a mixture of anger and pain. "This is old," she muttered, wincing. "It carries the essence of something dark, something that's latched onto your cat." I shuddered. "Latched on?" She nodded, placing the coin down carefully. Some entities use animals as vessels or messengers. Your cat may have been a stray, but he was already claimed by something else when you found him. My stomach roiled with guilt. Had I unknowingly brought evil into my home? What do I do? I asked, my voice quivering. Margot exhaled, rubbing her temples. We can try severing the connection, but it's risky. According to Margot, we need to form a protective circle, gather the objects, and recite a banishing prayer while Mr. Whiskers was present. If successful, the entity or force connected to these items would be driven away. But there was a chance it could lash out, especially if it had grown strong in my apartment. That night, Margot came to my place. We pushed the furniture aside in the living room and sprinkled a ring of salt on the floor. She lit candles at each corner, the flames flickering in the stale air. I brought the box of cursed objects, laying them in the center. Mr. Whiskers watched from the couch, tail swishing ominously. A tension filled the room, pressing down on my chest. Margot began chanting in a low, rhythmic tone. The language sounded ancient, each syllable resonating in the pit of my stomach. I stood behind her, tears threatening to spill as I watched the candle flames dance and snap. That was when Mr. Whiskers jumped off the couch, yelling. His cry was so loud it echoed off the walls. The lights flickered, and for an instant, I could swear I saw shadows move in the corners of the room, elongated shapes that defied explanation. Margot's chanting grew louder, more urgent. The cat paced around the salt circle, never crossing it but hissing at the objects as though they personally offended him. He darted toward me, claws out, forcing me to step back or risk being scratched. My heart pounded as I watched him lash his tail, first standing on end. Suddenly, the overhead light bulb burst with a pop. Glass rained onto the floor. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the candlelight flickering over Margot's pale face. She didn't stop chanting, her voice trembling but resolute. Mr. Whiskers let out another ear-splitting yowl. And then, silence. The candle's flame steadied, their light no longer guttering in unseen winds. I could breathe again. It felt as though the weight of a storm cloud lifted from the apartment. Margot lowered her head, panting. It's done, she managed. I've severed their link. Exhausted, we cleaned up the broken glass, carefully disposing of the candle remnants and sweeping away the salt. Margot insisted I leave the objects with her. She locked them away, ensure they caused no further harm. I agreed without hesitation. Once she left, I found Mr. Whiskers curled up on the windowsill. He looked tired, as though he'd run a marathon. When I approached, he blinked and rubbed his head against my hand. There was no hostility, no eerie intensity in his gaze. For the first time in weeks, it felt like I was looking at a normal cat. I slept soundly that night, no nightmares, no whispering in the dark. In the days following the ritual, the apartment felt lighter. My sleep improved. No more unexplained objects appeared on my floor. I even invited Melissa over again, and though she was hesitant, she commented that the oppressive atmosphere was gone. Still, a residual fear lingered in the back of my mind. Mr. Whiskers seemed calmer, more affectionate, but I couldn't completely forget how he acted before those unearthly yowls, the sinister items. I reminded myself that the cat had been a victim too, influenced by forces neither of us understood. Life began returning to a semblance of normal. The bookstore even offered me a few extra shifts. I used the money to replace the broken light fixture and to buy Mr. Whiskers a new, more comfortable bed. He seemed to appreciate it, curling up with a soft purr that made me smile. 3 weeks passed without incident. Then, late one night, I woke to a muffled cry. It sounded distant, like it came from outside. I rubbed my eyes, stumbling out of bed. Mr. Whiskers was already at the window, peering through the blinds. The street was dark, the alley empty. A siren wailed blocks away, but otherwise, all was still. I told myself I was just jumpy, that after everything that happened, I was prone to paranoia. Yet, a cold knot formed in my stomach, refusing to let me go back to sleep. And Mr. Whiskers? He stared outside for hours, as though keeping a silent vigil. That next morning, I found him pacing by the door, meowing softly. I had the strangest sense that he wanted to leave, that some lingering call was pulling him away. I called Margot for reassurance. Is it possible the entity's still out there, looking for him, or for me? She hesitated. I isolated it to the objects you gave me, which I've placed in secure containment. But sometimes echoes remain, especially if the entity was powerful. Don't ignore your instincts. A chill ran down my spine. I thanked her and hung up. That evening, I double-checked my locks, drew the curtains, and kept Mr. Whiskers indoors. He seemed restless, circling the apartment like he was searching for something. And I wondered, what if he's still connected, just in a weaker form? The next days were a blur of anxious routine: go to work, come home, feed Mr. Whiskers, try to sleep. But each morning, I'd wake up to find him sitting by the door, staring at the crack of light underneath. Something out there called to him. Something that wouldn't let go. One night, I couldn't sleep. My eyes kept drifting to the shadowy corners of the room, half expecting them to move. Around 3 a.m., I heard scratching at the front door. At first, I thought it was Mr. Whiskers. But he was in bed beside me, surprisingly calm. My heart kicked into overdrive. I inched into the hallway, gripping my phone as a makeshift flashlight. The scratching continued, urgent but muffled. I glanced at Mr. Whiskers. His eyes were open, fixated on the door. A surge of courage, or maybe recklessness, pushed me forward. I flung the door open. The hallway light was out. No one stood there. Just emptiness. But as soon as the door opened, Mr. Whiskers bolted past me and disappeared down the corridor. I gasped, calling his name. By the time I reached the stairs, he was gone. I ran outside, barefoot and shivering in the cool air. The street was empty, silent except for a distant car engine. Not a single trace of my cat. I searched for hours, calling out Mr. Whiskers, until my voice cracked. He never came back. I spent the following weeks plastering lost cat flyers around the neighborhood. I even posted on social media groups, offering a small reward for anyone who found him. No leads. With each passing day, my hope dwindled, replaced by a hollow ache in my chest. As unsettling as our time together had been, I realized I loved that cat, or at least the idea of him. I wanted to believe he was simply out there, exploring the world. But deep down, I suspected there was more at play. Perhaps he answered some silent call from the entity we cast out, or maybe he never truly belonged in the human world at all. No matter how many rational theories I spun, I always landed on the same uneasy conclusion: Mr. Whiskers was never really mine. Melissa tried to console me. Maybe he's living with another kind soul now, or he just found his way in the wild. Cats do that. Her voice was gentle, but I heard the unspoken words, or maybe he was something beyond our comprehension. Jacob offered quiet sympathy, occasionally suggesting we do another reading or some ritual to locate him. But I didn't have the energy. I felt drained, like a puppet with cut strings. Still, a lingering fear kept me from fully moving on. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear a faint scratching at the door or sense a flicker of movement outside the window. Each time, I'd race to check, heart pounding. Nothing was ever there. Strangely enough, I never found another cursed item in my apartment. The sense of dread dissipated gradually. Friends visited again, commenting on how the place felt brighter, more welcoming. I tried to enjoy the reprieve, but part of me missed the little gray fur ball, haunted or not. Months went by. I picked up extra shifts, started saving money to move to a better apartment. On a whim, I visited a different vet's office, in case someone had brought him in. No luck. The heartbreak of not knowing what happened nagged at me. I'd never gotten closure. Then, one day, as I was cleaning out a storage trunk, I found the coin. The same black coin I was sure Margot had taken away. It lay nestled in a corner under some old journals, its strange symbols catching the light. My heart nearly stopped. How had it ended up here? A chill radiated from it, the metal still unnaturally cold. I remembered Margot's words, some echoes remain. Was this an echo? Or was it a sign? I tossed it into the trash, sealed the bag, and brought it down to the dumpster immediately, my fingers trembling the whole time. But the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Whiskers was nearby, watching. One evening, nearly a year after his disappearance, I was walking home from work at twilight. I'd chosen a different route, looking for some new scenery, hoping a change of pace would shake off the memory-laden corners of my usual path. The air was crisp, leaves skittered across the sidewalk, and the sky was streaked with pink and orange. I turned a corner onto a quieter residential street. That's when I saw him, a gray cat sitting on a stone wall, tail curled neatly around his paws, his eyes reflecting the dying sunlight with a familiar green-gold hue. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, unsure if I was dreaming. "Mr. Whiskers?" My voice came out as a whisper. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, in a fluid motion, he hopped down from the wall and vanished into the alleyway. I sprinted after him, adrenaline surging. When I reached the alley, it was empty. No cat, no paw prints in the dust, nothing but a sense of lingering presence. I stood there for several minutes, breathing hard, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. Had I really seen him, or was my mind conjuring phantoms from old wounds? I'd never know for sure. In the end, I decided it was better not to chase shadows. If Mr. Whiskers had truly moved on, whether to the spirit world or simply another corner of this one, maybe that was where he belonged. The events that unfolded during our time together shaped me in ways I couldn't ignore. I learned that sometimes, the unexplainable slips through the cracks of ordinary life, and that not all mysteries find tidy resolutions. Even so, I can't deny the small ache that surfaces whenever I hear a cat's soft meow in the distance. There's a part of me that yearns for another chance, to hold him, to stroke his fur, to tell him I'm sorry for whatever darkness clung to him. But there's another part that feels relief, grateful that my home is no longer the staging ground for sinister forces. Sometimes, late at night, I light a candle and sit by the window, recalling the way his purr once vibrated through my apartment. I keep a single photo of him on my phone, the only one I managed to snap when he was napping by the window. He looks peaceful there, eyes closed, as if nothing in the world could harm him. Or me. Life goes on. I eventually moved to a new apartment with better insulation and fewer memories in the walls. I still work at the bookstore, saving up and considering going back to school. My nightmares have faded, though occasionally I dream of a cat's piercing eyes glowing in the dark. I'll wake, heart pounding, but there's no real terror left, just a bittersweet longing. The cursed objects are gone. Margot assures me she's destroyed them, scattering their remnants in a place she deems safe. She checks in occasionally, inviting me to her circle of eclectic friends who celebrate solstices and equinoxes. I haven't attended yet, but I might one day. I'm not the same skeptic I used to be. I've seen enough to keep an open mind. Every so often, I think about heading back to the alleyway where I first found Mr. Whiskers, just to see if there's any trace of him. But I never do. Maybe I'm afraid of discovering nothing, or worse, of finding something I'm not prepared to face again. Whether Mr. Whiskers was genuinely possessed or simply a conduit for forces beyond my understanding, I'll never fully know. What I do know is that our paths crossed in a way that changed me forever. I learned that some doors, once opened, can't be neatly closed. And though the immediate horror has passed, the lingering possibility of the supernatural remains. It's a quiet tension in the back of my mind, the knowledge that the world is stranger and darker than I used to believe. A knowledge that sometimes, in moments of reflection, feels almost comforting in its mystery. Because if a stray cat can bring such darkness, perhaps there's also a light equally profound out there, waiting for its moment to slip into our world. For now, I live with that question unanswered, carrying both fear and hope in equal measure. And when I look into the eyes of any cat crossing my path, I can't help but wonder if it, too, sees more than I ever will.